We are very happy to have you all here. And to begin with, I would like to introduce you to the Director of UCAR Community Programs, Scientific Programs and Services Center, and we are very happy Director to have you of CPAESS. And to begin with, I would like to introduce you to the Director.
Welcome, everyone. We are delighted to have you attend our first CPAESS Discovery Seminar Series. This series began to share the impressive breadth and depth of the research from CPAESS scientists who study the entirety of Earth system science. We have scientists who do everything from explore our ocean depths to fly into hurricanes to take critical measurements, to heliophysicists modeling coronal mass ejections, to those who unravel the mysteries of the Arctic. And we want to share this with the public, the NCAR UCAR community, and our many colleagues at universities across the globe. Just to orient you all, we are using Slido that you can pose questions for our speaker, which you can type in at any time during the seminar. The Slido window is located below this presentation screen. Do not panic if you do not see your question pop up, as we are holding questions until our speaker completes their presentation. Questions will be revealed later during the Q&A portion of the seminar. So it is my sincere pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Mukund Palat Rao. Mukund is an ecoclimatologist who researches the interactions between climate change and natural and human ecosystems. His expertise includes dendrochronology, plant ecophysiology, remote sensing, and climate science. He received his PhD in 2020 from Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University. While at Columbia, he investigated flooding in the Brahmaputra and Indus rivers in South Asia, and the hidden stories behind the construction of New York City in the 19th and early 20th century. As a NOAA Climate and Global Change postdoc fellow with UCAR at the University of California in Davis, he is currently working on projects to better understand and constrain the forest carbon cycle. As part of this work, he is developing a network of automated point dendrometers that measure hourly tree growth across North America and Europe. Today, Mukund will discuss the vulnerability of boreal forests in Mongolia to climate change with his talk, "Will the North Asian taiga become too hot for trees to capture carbon?" Welcome, Dr. Mukund Palat Rao.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and for that, for the introduction. And I'm really excited to be here. And as Hannah mentioned, today I want to talk to you all about climate change and warming in the boreal forest in North Asia and Mongolia specifically, and what that might mean for carbon uptake and carbon dynamics of the forests in the region. But before I begin, I want to thank the NOAA Climate and Global Change postdoctoral fellow, NSF, that's funded a lot of this research, and also thank my colleagues and collaborators without whom this work would not have been possible, especially colleagues in Mongolia who were instrumental in helping ensure this work happens and have been really great collaborators over the years. So the global distribution of biomes across the planet are quite to a large extent controlled by the environmental conditions. So this figure on the right shows the distribution of biomes in this axis of mean annual temperature on the x-axis, and on the y-axis it should be total annual precipitation. And we can see that the boreal forest, which is generally occurs in this region of low mean annual temperatures, kind of moderate amounts of precipitation. But the low mean annual temperatures are important because that makes sure that the evaporative demand in in these forests and ecosystems is not very high. So the figure on the left here shows the distribution of the globe of the circumpolar boreal biome shaded in this olive region. And then I've highlighted the outline of Mongolia here. And this smaller red rectangle shows what I define as the North Asian taiga. And this is the southernmost extent of the taiga. And here we're particularly interested in the southernmost extent of the taiga in North Asia. And one of the reasons we're interested in the southernmost extent is because there's a lot of evidence that at the southern or ecosystems are more vulnerable to climate change, particularly to warming at the southern extent of their range margins in the northern hemisphere, because these are the range margins that are exposed to the warmest temperatures relative to the distribution of certain biomes. Or an analogous to this would also be at the lower elevations along an elevational gradient. So let's just look more closely at biomes in this space of low mean annual temperatures and high precipitation given the low temperatures. So we can see that when you have these low mean annual temperatures, the x-axis now here is mean July temperatures, you can have different alternate stable attractor states that can occur depending just on either tree cover or local environmental conditions. So at cold temperatures, you can have a tundra-like ecosystem. At really warm temperatures, you can have a steppe or a grassland kind of ecosystem. And then in an intermediate ecosystem is the boreal forest. However, there's actually quite a bit of overlap between like the boreal forest and the tundra or the boreal forest and the steppe. But ecosystems can transition rapidly from one to the other if certain tipping points are passed. And there's a lot of paleoclimate and paleoecological evidence that regions have shifted from being one ecosystem type to another pretty rapidly when they've undergone some kind of environmental change or disturbance. The red star over here represents our study site in North Mongolia. And the next figure over here shows mean annual precipitation across Mongolia and the the southern margin of the North Asian taiga. And our study site is located about 25 to 50 kilometers from the Russian border. And it's one of the wettest sites wettest parts of Mongolia where mean annual precipitation is in excess of around 400 millimeters per year. And so overall, this region is pretty wet or pretty mesic. As a satellite image, you can see that this region is this part of Mongolia. That's our study site over here is the Russian border, and out here is pretty wet, and we can see that's why also this region is pretty green. But if you go a bit further south, you can see this large area of slightly brownish shading that mostly corresponds to grassland vegetation. So as just an image of what actually the site looks like, we can see that it looks pretty green. There's a river, the Eigengul River, that runs through the valley. And so there's a riparian zone. And then once you move away from the river system, you have these montane ecosystems that start at the kind of low elevation, but then extend up to the top of the mountains. There's differences in which different species prefer different parts of this ecosystem. So that's the same figure over here. We're in an elevational gradient from 900 meters to about 1700 meters. So by the river, we mostly have a mix of willows and aspens. So that's like the salix and aspens that live by the river. At the transition zone, we generally find Siberian elm. So that's maybe somewhere out here, just at the transition zone. And then right from the base of the montane ecosystem, or the montane part of this region, to the tops of the mountains are generally covered by Siberian larch or Larix siberica. And this species is going to be the main kind of focal point of our talk. And then Asian white birch, that's also a common species in the region. for some more context on the distributions of these species, Larix siberica, so the red star again is our study site. Larix siberica is generally a kind of a true boreal species, which most of its distribution is into Russia and Siberia, while North Mongolia here is at the southern range margin of its distribution. Eurasian aspen is located pretty much all through Eurasia and even into Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, but also extends further south into northeastern China and the Korean Peninsula. Siberian elm is mostly a Mongolian species, and Siberian elm at our study site is located at the northern range margin of its distribution. And the other species of interest was white birch, that is Betula platyphylla, that's located both a bit further northeast and also further south. So amongst all the species at our study site, Larix siberica is the only one that's located to the southern margin of its distribution. And as I mentioned previously, there's already some concern that in the northern hemisphere, biomes might be more vulnerable to climate change at their southern range margins, where they're exposed to most of the warming conditions. And similarly, species that are at their southern range margins might also be more vulnerable to warming than species that are located maybe to the northern limit of their range margins. So the question that we ask over here is whether Larix siberica is more vulnerable to climate change in this particular ecosystem. And Larix siberica is really a keystone species in the region. It provides really important habitat and shade during the summer for grazers. And as you can see in this figure here, almost 90 to even maybe 95% of the total biomass in the region is Larix siberica, while all of the other species make up a much smaller fraction of the biomass in the region. So in terms of how much is the carbon that plants and forests are taking up, most of that biomass and carbon is ending up as woody growth in the larch relative to the other species. And some more images of the larch providing important habitat and for grazers in the region, and these are mostly livestock that's being reared for mostly livestock. And another image that shows that larch is present not just in the montane ecosystems, but also extends down into the valley as well. But generally, it's more sparsely distributed in the valley relative to the montane region. So we know from a lot of research that the globe is warming pretty rapidly. So the figure on the left-hand side shows June, July, August temperatures relative to 1961 to 1980 for the globe from instrumental observations from the HAD crew data set. And then using CMIP6 simulations, the gray line over here shows historical projections of temperature, or historical hindcasts of temperature over the same period from 1950 to 2014. And then we have projections of what future temperature will be, assuming we either keep emitting carbon dioxide and follow a high emission fossil fuel driven trajectory known as SSP 8.5, or the Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 5, or we might end up in a world where if we are very good about mitigating reducing our emissions and even invest in carbon capture and storage technologies, we might even reduce the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. We might follow these lower emission pathways that will end up under which we'll end up with less warming at the end of this century in 2100 relative to instrumental temperatures. So, and then we have the spectrum of other possible options in the middle. So this is what has been observed in the globe and is what's projected out into the future for the globe. And then following the same format, I've added in over here a figure on the right that shows the evolution of temperatures in the North Mongolian boreal biome from observed data, historical simulations from CMIP-6, and then future projections of what June, July, August, or summertime temperatures will be in the future. One thing to note is that the y-axis is the scales are slightly expanded where we go from -2 to 12 degrees centigrade. So you can see that if we emit more CO2, we end up with warmer conditions as we'd expect than if we don't emit as much CO2 or even take up some CO2. So let's put these two plots together, and just for ease of display, I've taken out the uncertainty bars. Over the instrumental period from 1950 to 2020, we can see that the North Mongolian region has actually warmed quite a bit more than the global average. To be precise, it's warmed 3 times the global average. And then if we move forward into the future, we can see that North Mongolia, this boreal region, is expected to continue to warm faster than the globe is expected to warm. And a couple of reasons for this is that generally land warms faster than the ocean, so we'd expect land areas to warm faster. And in North Mongolia, as well as many other boreal regions across the world, we have this ice albedo feedback where because the ice is melting or snow is melting earlier on in the spring and summer, that means that during the summer season we have more exposed landscapes with lower albedo, and this kind of exacerbates the warming that occurs over these regions. And this is also one of the other factors why boreal regions, not just in North Mongolia, but boreal regions across the world are warming at a rate that's almost 2 to 3 times faster than the globe. So just to get some numbers over here, globally temperatures have warmed 0.62 degrees relative to 1961 to 1990 between 2001 to 2020, so over the past 2 decades. And then at the end of this century, between 2081 to 2100, we expect the globe to continue to warm, and along the spectrum of increasing warming if we emit more CO2. So this is for the globe. Now I've added in projections for North Mongolia. North Mongolia has warmed a median of 1.82 degrees centigrade between 2001 to 2020, so about 3 times that of the globe. And then if we move forward into the future, median warming projections for North Mongolia are about 1.7 times that of the globe for this 2081 to 2100 period at the end of the century. And the red dots over here just represent the ensemble median, because we use 26 models, but they have multiple. Some models are more ensemble members than other models, so the ensemble median accounts for the fact that there's a different number of ensemble members in some of the model runs that we used from the CMIP-6 database. So this is just a couple of figures from this recent review study that came out about thermal tolerance of photosynthesis, showing the number of articles that look at cold tolerance in photosynthesis in wild plants on the left and warm heat tolerance on the right-hand side. So we can see that both for cold tolerance and for heat tolerance, there's very few studies across most of Asia, and maybe just a handful of studies, except China has more studies, but generally like Kazakhstan, Mongolia, there are no studies. And then if we look more specifically at studies that divide this by either heat tolerance, heat and cold tolerance, or cold tolerance across different biomes, we can see that in the boreal biome, there's almost all studies have predominantly focused on the cold tolerance of boreal ecosystems. And this is because these ecosystems are generally pretty cold. But boreal regions also, during the summer, they can get really hot. For example, last year, regions in Siberia reached almost 40 degrees centigrade. There were really large wildfires as well. And the boreal regions, as I showed a couple of slides previously, are warming much faster than the global average. So I think it's time that we begin to look at the warm or heat tolerance of boreal ecosystems more seriously. So given all of this context, we need better quantification of both the vegetation physiology and its thermal tolerance to predict ecological change under a warming climate. So let's start first with trying to better understand the physiology of vegetation in the region. And to do that, we went out into the field with collaborators and tried to better understand the physiology of the five of the most important species that live in the boreal forest in the region. So one of the parameters we looked at was the photosynthetic capacity of different plants. And photosynthesis is the process by which trees and plants take up carbon dioxide and create sugars from them. And so this is the primary mechanism by which, or this is the mechanism by which plants are taking up carbon dioxide. And overall, at a planetary or a global scale, plants and forests are taking up and storing about 20 to 30% of the CO2 that we are currently emitting into the atmosphere. So this process of photosynthesis plays a really important role in the global carbon cycle. So one of the parameters that we measured in the field were we took these 5 species, subjected them to increasing amounts of light, and then looked at a parameter known as the electron transport rate that's closely related to the rates of photosynthesis, and looked at either how fast the electron transport rates increases as light increases, what is the level at which the electron transport rate saturates. And so generally, if you have higher electron transport rates, can correspond to a higher capacity for photosynthesis relative to species that might saturate, say, at a lower level. So this is what some of the curves look like for the 5 species that we studied. The numbers in the brackets here are the number of individuals that we studied. So the x-axis here is photosynthetic photon flux density, or photosynthetically active radiation. And it's measured in micromoles per photons per meter square per second. And just for some context, full sunlight has a ppfd of around 2000 micromoles photons per meter square per second. Kind of bright sunlight is around 1200. So we get pretty close to generally like high light levels. And the y-axis here is the electron transport rate that I mentioned previously. And so what we found is that Larix siberica consistently has higher rates of electron transport for the same light levels compared to all of the other species in the landscape. And we also looked at other parameters such as how fast the rates of electron transport are increasing, what is the minimum radiation level at which this curve begins to saturate, and the maximum amounts of electron transport rate that are achieved under these light response curves. And under all of these, or using all of these parameters, we consistently found that Larix siberica has higher photosynthetic capacity than the other species. Next, we wanted to look at the carbon and isotopic composition in the leaves, because this can also tell us the foliar nutrients or foliar isotopic composition can also tell us about vegetation physiology of plants. So we cut up the leaves, ran them through a mass spectrometer, and looked at the relative ratio of stable isotopes of carbon, specifically carbon-12 and carbon-13. And carbon-13 is this slightly heavier isotope of carbon, which is less common but is present in the planet. And we also looked at the relative concentrations of the lighter isotope, stable isotope of oxygen, delta 16O, and the heavier isotope of oxygen, 18O. So for some theory on how to interpret this data, generally, if the leaves are closing their stomata pretty often, so this is an illustration of a leaf, and these are the stomates. If the plant closes its stomates very often, and this generally happens if the plants are water stressed or drought water limited, because when they have less water, the plants have to close their stomates so that they don't lose water. And when this happens, because photosynthesis is an where where plants are getting water from the roots and in exchange for carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, if the plants close their stomates, they have no option but to use the heavier isotope of carbon in the leaves for photosynthesis. But generally, plants always prefer the lighter isotopes because it's easier for metabolism. But if the plants have closed their stomates, there's no new CO2 coming in from the outside, so the plants become enriched in carbon-13. But at the same time, because the plants have closed their stomates and evaporation, transpiration has been reduced, there's also an enrichment of oxygen in the leaves as well. So you tend to get when stomates are closed and the plants are water limited, you tend to get a positive relationship between the delta carbon 13 in the leaf and the delta 18O in the leaf. And you see generally this positive relationship where as the plants keep closing their stomates, both of these both of these elements become enriched in their composition. However, if the rates of photosynthesis are controlling the isotopic composition of the leaf, this means that the stomates of the leaves are continuously open and the plant is just trying to photosynthesize as rapidly as it can. And because the plants are trying to photosynthesize very rapidly, what happens is first the plant uses all the light isotope because it prefers the light isotope, but then the plant within the leaf, because the diffusion of CO2 from outside to inside is relatively slow, and there's a fractionation step involved in that. Because the plants are photosynthesizing rapidly, they will end up still using a lot of the carbon-13 to photosynthesize. However, because the stomates are continuing to remain open, there's free exchange of water from the inside of the leaf to the outside through transpo-evaporative losses. And so if the photosynthetic rate is controlling the isotopic composition of the leaf, we expect that as there to be no real relationship between the carbon isotopes and the oxygen isotopes in the leaves. So after all of this theory, what did we actually find? We found that carbon isotopes were more enriched in the larch, in Larix siberica, relative to all of the other species. These letters on top of all of the box plots indicate that whether the difference between two box plots or two species is significant or not. So if there is no shared letter between a species, that means that the mean isotopic composition of larch, for example, is statistically significantly greater than that for the birches, for example. So, but if you compare birch and elms, because they both share a B, there is no statistical difference between these two. So we found that consistently the larches, the Larix, which is the first column over here, had more enriched carbon-13 values than all of the other species. Next, we looked at the oxygen isotopic composition of the leaves and found that similar to the trends in carbon, the oxygen isotope in the leaves were also more enriched. That means there was more 18O relative to the standard and relative to all of the other species in the larches. So this means that both the larches are both enriched in oxygen and enriched in carbon. But now the question was, is this stomatal conductance, or is this because the larches are likely photosynthesizing more? So we plotted this similar to the conceptual figure. We looked at species-specific relationships between their foliar carbon-13 and delta 18O, and found that generally for the larch, so that's the red lines over here, there was no positive relationship between the carbon-13 and delta 18O. And if we expected that stomatal conductance or water was the limiting factor, we would have expected this relationship to be positively correlated. And because we do not see any relationship between these two variables, this suggests that The enriched carbon-13 in the leaves is because of likely due to higher rates of photosynthesis. However, we also see that there's this clear gradient of depleted depleted oxygen values for the salix, slightly more enriched for the elms and the poplars and the birch, and finally most enriched values for oxygen, in oxygen for the larch. And we think that this is likely to do with microsite differences in elevation. So for example, the larches and the salix and the poplars are located in this riparian zone by the river, where they're growing in mostly in saturated soils, while the birches, the betula, and the larix, the larches, are growing at slightly drier soils in the montane region that are better drained. And this allows as the soil dries, because the lighter oxygen isotope evaporates faster than the heavier isotope of oxygen, the soils become enriched in the heavier isotope of oxygen. And this is one reason why the species that are at slightly higher elevation in slightly drier, better drained soils have higher oxygen 18 concentrations relative to the other species. Next, we were interested in trying to see, is this higher composition, or is this better photosynthetic performance or capacity related to nitrogen availability? So we looked at the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the leaves of all of the species and found that Larix siberica had a significantly higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than all of the other species that broadly had similar carbon to nitrogen ratios. This is a bit surprising because a high carbon to nitrogen ratio means more carbon relative to nitrogen. And nitrogen is a really important element for plant physiology because it's the building block of this photosynthetic enzyme known as rubisco, and about 30 to 40% of the leaf nitrogen is used in this building block. That's actually the most abundant enzyme on the planet. So generally, if plants have more nitrogen, that corresponds to better photosynthetic performance. But in our case, we found that the larches had lower amounts of nitrogen. And this suggests that the higher photosynthetic performance of larches may be something that's inherent to the species and it's not related to microsite differences in nitrogen availability. And this is also confirmed by nitrogen isotope data as well. So to conclude this part of our study, we find that larch has the highest photosynthetic capacity of all the species in the landscape. And this perhaps can also be one reason why larch is such a successful species in the region. It just has this higher, better capacity to take up carbon dioxide from and assimilate carbon dioxide. So as I discussed earlier, we need not just a better quantification of the physiology of vegetation, but because the boreal region is warming so rapidly, we need better quantification of the thermal tolerance of the species as well to predict ecological change. So now let's look at the thermal tolerance of these different species. To better understand the thermal tolerance of the species, we ran this experiment known as a temperature fluorescence curve to calculate this parameter known as Tcrate, or the critical temperature of photosystem 2 breakdown. And this is the if leaf temperatures exceed Tcrate, their photosynthetic apparatus begins to break down, more specifically the thylakoid membranes in the leaves that are a building block for the photosystem 2. These membranes begin to break down and they become leaky, and then the enzymes kind of spread everywhere. So the leaf can no longer photosynthesize if leaf temperatures exceed Tcrate. How did we calculate Tcrate? We took leaves from these trees and then slowly heated the leaves at 1 degree centigrade per minute and looked at their baseline minimal chlorophyll fluorescence rates. So we started up at around 20 degrees centigrade, heated the leaves at 1 degree centigrade per minute, And then at some point, when the leaf gets warm enough, we can see this exponential rise in the rates in the minimal chlorophyll fluorescence, in the values of minimal chlorophyll fluorescence. And the breakpoint in the curve, the vertical dashed black line over here at the intersection of the two breakpoint regression lines, corresponds to the Tcrate of this particular large leaf. And once leaf temperatures exceed this Tcrate value, many studies have shown that even if the leaves are cooled back to cooled again, they do not recover their photosynthetic capacities. This kind of Tcrate analysis has been done globally across many species before. This is a paper from 2017 by O'Sullivan et al., where they looked at Tcrate, so that's in the pink dots over here, across a latitudinal gradient from the equator to around 65 degrees north, both in the northern and southern hemisphere. And they found that globally, Tcrate is higher, not surprisingly, at the equator, because these plants are generally exposed to warmer conditions than plants closer to the extratropics. So as we go from the equator of 0 degrees to around 45 to 60 degrees north, 45 degrees south, we can see the Tcrate decreases along this broadly linear curve. And this decrease in Tcrate, the critical temperature of photosynthesis, corresponds to an increase in the temperature of the mean of the warmest month of the year. Let's just thinking about the northern hemisphere, generally July tends to be the warmest month. So around 60 degrees north, we can see that maybe July temperatures are around 15 degrees centigrade. But as we move towards the equator, July temperatures might become around 35 to 38 degrees centigrade. So globally, Tcrate varies between 39 to around 50 degrees centigrade. And if we look at this trend in Tcrate with warming or with seasonal warming across the planet, we can see that Tcrate increases by about 0.3 degrees centigrade per centigrade in warming of the mean of the warmest month. So what did we find for Tcrate for the species that we are interested in? We found that Larix iberica, which is the only true boreal species in the region, has a significantly lower Tcrate with a mean of around 43 degrees centigrade, significantly lower Tcrate than all of the other species that have Tcrates between around 47 to 50 degrees centigrade. So there's about a 3 to 5 degrees centigrade difference between Larix iberica and all of the other species. There's some evidence that Tcrate is also a function of elevation, because at higher elevations, plants and anything at a higher elevation is not exposed to as warm conditions as the lower elevation. So we also looked at this Tcrate parameter along the elevational gradient that we have. So all of the colors here correspond to the different species. So Tcrate is on the y-axis here again, with the same scales as the figure on the left, but the x-axis over here is elevation from 900 to 1700 meters. And what we found is most of our samples come from this rather narrow elevational band between 1150 meters in elevation to around 1050 meters to 1112 meters. And even in this narrow band of around 56 meters, the Larix in red generally have lower Tcrates than all of the other species, particularly lower Tcrate than the Salix and the poplars in the yellow and purple shading respectively. So while there might be some role of elevation in the lower Tcrate of Larix iberica, elevation does not explain a 3 to 5 degree lower Tcrate, because over 56 meters, I think, based on moist adiabatic lapse rate, mean temperatures are cooler by about 0.3 degrees. But the difference we have is an order of magnitude greater than what we would expect on elevation alone. And obviously, making these measurements take a lot of time, but one thing to also note is that Larix siberica is actually pretty abundant at the lower elevations as well. So that's the riparian zone again. And Larix siberica starts at the base of the mountains, so that's large, and extends all the way to the top of these mountain ecosystems. And here's another image of Larix siberica closer to the riparian zone. So Larix siberica is abundant at the warm lower elevations as well. So one thing that to note is that it's not just the mean temperature or temperature extremes and not mean temperature are generally a driver of survival for plants or even survival for humans during heat waves. And so far we've mostly been discussing discussed warming in mean temperatures. So we were then interested in understanding, okay, how are extreme temperatures, extremes changing, and not just the mean temperature. So we went back into the CMIP6 archive and looked at, or were able to get projections of warming of the temperature of the hottest day at our study site, so classified as TXX. The blue lines here are observed or instrumental TXX from a reanalysis product known as the ERA5 product. The gray lines are historical projections or simulations of TXX, or the temperature of the hottest day in the year, which generally occurs between June, July, and August in our region. And then these are projections of TXX out in the future based on these different emission scenarios. And one of the things we see is that once we cross around 2060 or so, under the two warmer or higher emission scenarios, we see consistently that there's actually quite a few days where the temperature of the hottest day exceeds 40 degrees centigrade quite often. And again, as I mentioned, we're interested here in the extremes of temperature. So what's the variability and not the mean temperatures? Because during a heat wave, you might only have 1 or 2 days in July that get really hot, even if July as a whole is not maybe as hot. So the figure on the right shows box plots of the range or the distribution of future temperatures of the hottest day under these 4 different scenarios from 2060 to 2100. So that's between here to here. And the current range of the critical temperature for Larix siberica. So if the temperatures exceed this particular range for Larix siberica, that would permanently damage the ability for larches to conduct photosynthesis. So what we see is that some of these higher emission scenarios, we begin to see some overlap. We're beginning to see some overlap between the temperatures of the hottest day and the critical temperatures of Larix siberica. However, one complication over here is that the critical temperature of photosynthesis, Tcrate, has been shown to acclimate both seasonally and as climate worms. And so it would be not a fair comparison to compare temperatures of the hottest day in 2060 relative to Tcrate in 2019. And to account for this, we took the global number that I mentioned from the studies previously of the Tcrate warms 0.38 degrees centigrade per degree warming of the temperature of the maximum month to first develop projections of how Tcrate might change into the future as temperatures warm. So this is the current distribution in black of the Tcrate for Larix siberica, and these lines represent our most optimistic projections of what is the maximum amount of acclimation that can happen with the critical temperature for larch into the future for both the median Tcrate, maximum Tcrate, and the minimum Tcrate. And these dots over here are illustrations of where the Tcrate for Larix siberica will end up in 2100 based on different amounts of warming into the future. So here we under the low emission scenario, we end up with broadly similar Tcrates to the current day, while under the high emission scenario, we end up with slightly warmer Tcrates. That means larches have acclimated a bit and have a higher thermal safety margin moving into the future. And just want to reiterate that this is a very optimistic estimate because we are using this 0.38 degrees centigrade warming in Tcrate with per degree centigrade of warming. And this is a number that's much higher than field-based studies at a particular site, both seasonally and across distribution ranges, tracking the same species. And so we're using this much higher global number. So now this allows us to ask the question, will temperatures exceed the Tcrate of Larix siberica? However, one other minor complication is that leaf temperatures can actually significantly exceed air temperatures by quite a bit. So here, this is a leaf that over here, it's absorbing some shortwave radiation and then cooling by emitting long-wave radiation, heat flux, and latent heat flux. And this latent heat flux is an important mechanism to cool the leaf because as the leaves are taking in carbon dioxide from the leaf, they're transpiring water. And this process cools the leaves by quite a bit. However, there are times when if the stomates close, then this exchange of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and transpiration of water can cease, and the leaves no longer are cooling with this latent heat flux. And this can happen when we have increasing drought that causes stomatal closure. And for the North Mongolian region, we know that temperatures are projected to keep warming, but there's going to be, our CMIP6 projections of precipitation show no increases in precipitation. So under the future scenario of warmer temperatures but constant precipitation or similar precipitation, we expect rising vapor pressure deficits or atmospheric dryness that will likely cause plants to experience more drought-like conditions. That can cause plants to close their stomates, increase leaf temperatures, and then even on a daily basis, there's this phenomenon known as the midday depression of photosynthesis, where during the hottest part of the day, generally around 1 to 2 p.m., plants generally close their stomates a little bit, and photosynthesis and carbon assimilation is suppressed during the peak hot conditions of the day. And together, both of these features can lead to offsets of around 5 to 20 degrees centigrade between leaf and air temperatures, with leaves both on a daily cycle, daily scale and a seasonal scale being upward warmer by 5 to 20 degrees centigrade. And actually, the kind of standard number is between 10 to 20, but 5 is on the lower range. So what we did is, how can we extrapolate to get leaf temperatures from air temperatures? And what we used is a parameter known as the skin temperature as an approximation for the leaf temperature. So Txx in the black line here is the temperatures of the hottest day. We got this skin temperatures from the ERA 5 product, and we found that there's this offset of around 4 degrees centigrade between the temperature of the hottest day, 2-meter air temperature of the hottest day, and skin temperature. And just for some more context, skin temperature is the skin temperature is defined as the temperature of a surface at radiative equilibrium, and it's analogous to how hot do you feel in how hot would a surface feel to touch under these conditions. So we then go with this 4-degree offset between air temperature and skin temperatures as an approximation of leaf temperatures. So this is our projection. These are again our projections of temperatures of the hottest day on the left-hand side. The right-hand side are projections of Tcrate to the future, and we know that let's assume that there's a 4-degree offset between air temperatures and leaf temperatures. So together with these two things, we can come to our main part of the main finding, which is, do temperatures exceed the Tcrate of Larix siberica? So the figure on the left-hand side shows how often or how many days per year will the temperatures of the leaf exceed the minimum Tcrate of Larix siberica, and this is the mean on the y-axis. The blues are for the low emission scenario, the yellows are for the lower medium emission scenarios, and the orange and the red are for the higher emission scenarios. And what we see is that after around 2060, we generally get around 1 to 2 days per year where leaf temperatures can potentially exceed the minimum Tcrate of Larix siberica. While this doesn't seem like a lot, this exceedance in a way represents a critical or a tipping point in the ecosystem where, because leaves can never recover from this exceedance, this will mean that eventually, if this happens frequently enough, Larix siberica can no longer survive in this landscape. However, this mean number is a bit misleading or is a bit low because of the fact that in any given year, because of random variability, we have leaf temperatures can either exceed Tcrate or not exceed Tcrate. So a better way to look at this would be to take all 56 ensemble members that we have and look at the number of days per year leaf temperatures exceeds the minimum Tcrate from 2019 to 2100 for all of the 56 models instead of calculating the mean. And because generally most models, or because of natural variability in the climate system, most models do not exceed Tcrate in a given year. But once we cross 2060, we can see that 10 to 20 models generally exceed Tcrate 1 day a year after 2060, and there's even around 1 to 10 models that are exceeding Tcrate 5 to 6 days per year once we cross 2060. So this is for the warmest scenario. At SSP 3.7.0, we see that generally there's not many exceedances because of natural variability, but once we cross 2060, we see 10 to 20 models exceeding the Tcrate 1 to 2 days per year, and with even some higher numbers exceeding the minimum Tcrate of Larix siberica. What does this look for the median Tcrate? So that's a higher threshold where half of the Larix siberica could get damaged, and so just a few. We can see that there's 1 to 2 days per year that about 10 ensemble members show at once we cross 2060, and then under the lower emission scenario, we have about 1 to 2 days per year at the end of this century. So the good news is that the maximum Tcrate of Larix siberica is never exceeded, but a caveat is that we have assumed very high acclimation of Larix siberica at this point, 0.38 degrees centigrade per centigrade of warming, and a very low offset of 4 degrees centigrade between leaf temperatures and the 2-meter air temperatures of the hottest day. And we're using low spatio-temporal resolution data, that's hourly data that's averaged over a large area. So at a local scale, or all of these estimates are very conservative estimates, but at a local scale, there is possibility that maybe these scenarios can be a bit optimistic. So we hope that at the end, what we do not see is large-scale mortality of Larix siberica that we have observed in the field a little bit. So these are some images of mortality in Larix siberica. So now it's 11:56. So just end with the conclusions over here. So what we found is Larix siberica has the highest photosynthetic capacity of the five species. It has the lowest critical temperature of the 5 species, likely attributable to being located at its southern range limit, but altitude might play some role over here. Larix siberica is more vulnerable to warming relative to the other species in boreal North Mongolia, and the Tcrate of Larix siberica may be exceeded for some individual, and if we did not have enough reasons already, this is another reason to keep working towards reducing our emissions to ensure we don't cross these tipping points in these ecosystems. And finally, one thing that I think maybe those in the UCAR community might be interested in, particularly those involved in Earth system models, is that generally photosynthesis or carbon assimilation in models is parameterized as an optimum curve in Earth system models where you have low assimilation at low temperatures, peaking, and then it peaks around 30 degrees centigrade and then decreases again. But in reality, there are these tipping points where if temperatures cross Tcrate, there might be zero carbon assimilation, and so maybe this is something that we need to also work towards including in Earth system models. That I'd like to thank all the collaborators in the field at Tarvaktai, without whom this work would have been impossible. And thank you all for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions on the Slido if we have some time.
Thank you so much for sharing your research with us, Mukund. We truly appreciate it. So now to our Q&A portion of today's seminar. I'd like to direct everyone's attention to just beneath the viewing portion of the webpage you are currently on. If you scroll down a little, you can see we have Slido set up for you to ask Mukund any questions you may have about his presentation, or you can also use the QR code on the screen. And so while you're doing that, I would also like to invite you to also attend our next seminar on Wednesday, April 20th, 2022, with CPAESS marine archaeologist Philip Hartmeyer and his work with NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration titled The Marine Archaeology Portfolio of NOAA Ocean Exploration. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk, Mukund. If anybody has a question, please let us know.
Is there a way for me to see the Slido? The questions?
They will show up, Mukund, on this major slide that has the QR code in front of you right now.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
we don't have any questions just yet.
Okay. No worries. Thanks.
Well, we'll stop if any questions pop up. But in the meantime, thank you so much again, Mukund. And I think because it's 11:59, Hannah, maybe we can close.
Yes, let's go ahead and do that. So thank you. I would like to thank you all. There is a question. Okay.
We do have a question. This is from Bill Quo. Based on your work, do you have any suggestions for improvement in global climate models?
Yeah, I feel like how exactly we can do this parameterization might, I think one simple way the easiest thing I can think of is to see if we can get more global field-based estimates of Tcrate and better understand how it acclimates, and then parameterize that either at like a plant functional type in ecosystem models, or I think that can be one, or that's the easiest solution that I think of right now is we cannot just say photosynthesis decreases linearly as temperatures increase, because at some point they decrease faster than that. So we figure out a way to add this in. Thank you, Bill. And if I just add, if I'm happy to, if someone has any questions, I'm happy to be in touch on email, and I think it should be possible to find my email by searching for my name online. Thank you. Thank you.
That's not,
Thank you again to everyone for attending and the invitation to present.
thank you, Mukund. I would like to thank all of you for coming to this CPAESS Discovery Seminar and remind you to go to our website to find out future talks at cpaess.ucar.edu. There you will find a link to this talk after it's uploaded to YouTube. Mukund, our sincere thanks to you for sharing your important research with us. Thank you also to Brett Batterman of UCAR Multimedia Services for his valuable assistance. I hope to see you all on April 20th for our next CPAESS Discovery Seminar. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you.